They pushed me toward the buffet like I was meant to be part of the decor. Smiling, quiet, the sort of background figure whose presence reassured strangers that everything was proper. I stood by the silver chafing dishes, hands folded as if I were waiting for instructions, and felt the weight of 100 small dismissals settle into my bones. Before we continue, make sure to hit the like button. Also tell us in the comments, what time is it where you are right now and which city are you watching from? I love seeing how far our stories travel. It was supposed to be a simple visit. Drop by the anniversary reception my son's community was hosting at the Crescent Oaks Retirement and Wellness Center, say hello, smile for a picture, and leave. Instead, it felt like walking into a room where everyone knew their parts and I had missed the rehearsal. The chandeliers threw cold light over linen-clad tables and silverware so polished you could see your own stubborn face in them. Men in crisp suits laughed in small, practiced bursts. Women adjusted shawls and tilted wine glasses as if they held the answers to some private puzzle. My son stood near the podium, the center of an orbit I had helped create and somehow no longer belonged to. He noticed me the way a tide notices a pebble, with barely a ripple of concern then indifference. He did not approach. Instead, he called out loud enough for the entire main room to hear, "Get out, old man, this isn't for you." It landed with the cruelty of a practiced line. Conversation hiccuped, forks paused mid-air. The smile that had been my shield since my wife died thinned. There are moments when humiliation arrives so precisely it seems engineered. I felt every eye pin me down like a specimen under a glass. My son's friends glanced between him and me, trading the small, sharp judgments people keep for public spaces. I wanted absurdly to tell them a story about the long draft plans, the models spread across my garage table, the nights I walked the foundation lines to argue with engineers, the checks I wrote, not to buy favor but to make a place that treated old people with tenderness. Not a peal of trophies but a home. Instead, I stayed quiet. The quiet is not the same as weakness. It is a deliberate thing. It is the hush you keep when you are cataloging what you will do next. And there are sometimes terrible costs to announcing every thought. I had learned the economy of restraint over a life of fixing beams and budgets and impossible deadlines. People who design and build learn to see structure where others see chaos. They learn patience because everything that matters takes time to set. Before the laughter could swell into something louder, the director crossed the room. She wore a navy blazer and the kind of calm that had been practiced in many meetings. "Mr. Alder," she said. She had used my name like a small bell and it struck clear. "It is an honor to see you." The room shifted. A woman near the head table rose and applauded. Someone else, a volunteer with a clipboard, stepped forward with that unmistakable look of recognition. The kind you get when an artisan, unknown to the thousands who benefit, walks into the work of his hands. People who had just been ready to laugh were now awkwardly offering bows of respect. I did not leap into that sudden esteem. I felt it like warmth on a winter day through a window, but it was thin against what my son had done. Respect from strangers is not a balm for wounds cut by one's own flesh. I watched my son's face as color drained, not the shame of a man who had been found out so much as the quick calculation of someone who realized an asset had evaporated. He slunk a step back into the crowd he had been cultivating, eyes darting for allies. After the applause and the polite inquiries, I found a quiet corner behind a bank of palms and a potted ficus, the kind of plant that pretends to be an interior justice. My hand tightened around a paper cup of coffee until the cardboard folded. People came and went, offering condolences for my chest. Small talk about the weather and, with practiced gentility, the exact overfamiliar apologies strangers give to elders who happen to be present. "Your son is so busy," one woman said. "You should sit down, sir." As if my place at that table were a function of someone's calendar. I let them think what they wanted. Their opinions were not what had me awake that night in my study sorting deeds and receipts. My memory was full of other things. The clatter of my wife's laugh in a kitchen that smelled of lemon and wood polish. The exact hour my son was born, a tiny furious thing with big hands, and the slow mechanics of a man who loved by solving problems. Love, I had learned, is sometimes the patient act of taking what you have and making it tidy for the people you care about. After the reception, I walked outside the building alone. The southern air smelled like salt and magnolia. The city lights, Charleston, always a polished diorama of itself, glimmered like promises. I sat on a bench and watched a limousine take my son and his crowd away. Their laughter caught and held like a net. My hands, used to measuring plumb lines and joint tolerance, smoothed the fold in my jacket. It occurred to me, not with malice but with a slow, inevitable clarity, that the distance between us had not appeared overnight. It had been built, plank by plank, with me supplying the wood and him choosing where to nail it down. When I was young, I thought the scaffolding of a life was primarily physical. Beams, bricks, contracts. As I grew older, I came to see how much of the architecture that holds a family together is invisible. Expectation, gratitude, duty. A house with good framing can collapse because its people rot the joists with neglect. I had, perhaps unwisely, believed that by providing security and taste and a sense of order, I was teaching my son how to live. Instead, I may have taught him to expect the service without learning the labor. Back at home, in the spare room that used to be my wife's sewing nook, I opened a desk drawer and took out a small ledger. It was worn at the corners, the ink fading where too many hands had read it. In that book, I kept a record of things I had paid for without complaint. A down payment here, a tuition there, the check for the design consultation that turned into a blueprint for Crescent Oaks. The numbers did not sting as much as the memory of the conversations. The easy words my son would say about helping out, as if it were a hobby and not a lifeline. I told myself I would be methodical. Method is my refuge. The first thing I did was sit at my desk and list without drama every expense and every favor I had extended in the name of fatherhood. Not as an exercise in accounting for revenge, but to see clearly what had been done and what had been assumed. There is a particular comfort in ledger lines. They do not lie. They do not plead. They only record. I spread the pages and began. Outside, the evening folded into the hush of a low tide. Inside, the house held its breath like a congregation waiting for the sermon. I did not know yet whether the work ahead would be litigation, confrontation, or quiet withdrawal of support. I only knew that I could no longer be the silent vault for my son's ambitions. There are moments when the bones of a man's life require new scaffolding. Sometimes a single decision, simple and final, can set those beams in place. That night I moved from shame to a fierce clarity, the way light moves across a room. The next morning I would call the lawyer I had used years ago for the gallery lease. I would get copies of deeds. I would ask questions of the accountants. It was not vindictiveness that propelled me. It was the slow, exacting desire to be seen. Not as the butt of a joke, not merely as an ATM, but as a man who had made things last. The kind of man who understands that dignity, like a good foundation, is non-negotiable. Characters introduced so far and consistency check. Protagonist, narrator, and retired engineer, father. First-person perspective, aged late 60s, reflective, no inconsistencies. My son, role. Estranged child, recently married into status, publicly humiliates his father. Relationship and behavior consistent with outline. Materialistic, cruel in public. Director of Crescent Oaks. Role facility administrator who recognizes and greets the protagonist as founder, funder. Serves to create public reversal. Volunteer guests. Assorted facility guests who shift from ridicule to respect. Present to show social reactions, no individual names introduced to keep focus on relationships. Margaret, referred to indirectly as my wife in memories. Deceased spouse whose memory informs protagonist's motivations. Listed by role only to maintain consistency with relational rule. No contradictions found among introductions. Family members are referenced by relationship only and non-family are described by role. I didn't sleep that night. The air in my house felt too still, too rehearsed. Like a stage set left intact after the actors had gone home. I sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open, the pages illuminated by the small pool of light from the old brass lamp my wife once insisted we keep. I could almost see her there, barefoot, hair pinned loosely, folding laundry and humming that off-key tune she used whenever she was thinking. It had been 12 years since she left, yet she was still the last sound in every quiet room. The next morning I drove to the waterfront. The city was waking, delivery trucks rumbling, gulls tracing lazy circles above the pier. Crescent Oaks stood across the marshland, its facade reflecting the pale light of dawn. Seeing it from a distance always stirred something inside me. A strange mixture of pride and shame. Pride because I had designed it, shame because of what it had become. When we first dreamed it up, my wife and I weren't thinking about profit. We were thinking about the loneliness we'd seen in her aging parents. The way good people faded when the world decided they were finished. I wanted to build a place that didn't look like a hospital pretending to be a home. I wanted light, air, gardens that reminded residents that beauty didn't have an expiration date. She called it Crescent Oaks because she believed oaks understood endurance. Back then, my son had been different. He was 27, still idealistic, still speaking softly when he entered a room. He'd help me draft ideas sitting cross-legged on the floor of my study. He'd sketch possible layouts on tracing paper, his lines quick and confident. We talked about how design could restore dignity to people who had lost it. He used to say, "We'll build something that treats the elderly like they're still living, not waiting." I remember the first real disagreement we had. It wasn't about money, not directly. It was about an investor, one of his college acquaintances, who wanted to modernize the idea. "Dad," my son had said, "people pay for prestige, not philosophy." He was smiling when he said it, as if that softened the meaning. I told him Crescent Oaks would never be about prestige. He laughed, lightly then carelessly, and said, "That's why you'll never make real money in this business." It was a small wound, but the kind that doesn't heal straight. Over time, small wounds become architecture. They shape what follows. When my wife was diagnosed, the project was half built. She'd sit by the window watching the cranes move steel across the sky. I'd tell her that each beam would hold a little of her strength. She'd smile and say, "Then make sure they're built to last." The day she died, I spent the afternoon in my office reviewing blueprints because grief, for men like me, finds refuge in lines and numbers. My son handled the funeral arrangements. He was efficient, kind in front of others, distant when it was just us. After we buried her, he didn't stay the night. He said there were meetings, investors to see. Within a year, Crescent Oaks opened. The dedication plaque bore 3 names, mine, hers, and his. He had insisted on it, said it looked balanced. I didn't argue. The first residents moved in that fall, and I spent weeks walking the halls, making small adjustments. Window height, handrail placement, acoustics in the dining area. It felt good to fix things. It made me believe that building was a kind of prayer. But success changed the air around us. The investors multiplied, the mission blurred. By the third year, my son was holding press conferences, giving interviews where he referred to himself as the visionary founder. My name became a footnote, early collaborator, design consultant. When I confronted him, he said, Dad, this is branding. You wouldn't understand. People want a younger face." I remember standing in his office that day. Glass walls, chrome desk, the skyline behind him like a digital backdrop. I told him he was forgetting what the place was for. He said, "It's for profit, Dad. Profit keeps it alive." I looked at him and realized the boy who once drew skylights for his grandparents had vanished. I didn't cut him off then. I told myself he'd come around, that the arrogance was temporary. But arrogance is like mold. It thrives in corners you stop inspecting. When he started wearing tailored suits and talking about scaling operations, I stopped visiting his office altogether. We'd exchange polite calls on holidays, each conversation shorter than the last. Years passed like pages torn from a notebook. Crescent Oaks grew, added wings, spas, private dining halls. It became a brand, not a home. I watched from a distance as my son rose on the foundation of our shared dream. I was proud, I told people. I wasn't lying. But pride and grief often occupy the same space. Then came the invitation, or rather the flyer I received in the mail announcing the 10-year anniversary gala. The photo on the front showed my son shaking hands with the mayor, smiling in front of the building I had designed. My name was nowhere on it, no mention of my wife either. It was as if the origin story had been erased, rewritten for convenience. I decided to attend without telling him. I suppose part of me still believed that seeing me there might remind him of who he used to be. You already know how that turned out. When the director greeted me as our founder, I felt the audience's collective discomfort wash over my son like a cold tide. But as I drove home afterward, humiliation gave way to something sharper, a recognition that history left unguarded becomes anyone's to claim. My wife's name deserved better than to be forgotten in a press release. My work deserved better than to be repackaged as someone else's brand. That night I opened the old project files. Rolled out blueprints still smelled faintly of graphite and glue. My handwriting marched across the margins, measurements, revisions, initials. I traced one note with my finger. Lighting along west corridor, maximize morning sun for east-facing rooms. She had loved that note, said the light made people hopeful. The next morning I visited the site alone. Residents were out in the courtyard, some in wheelchairs, some walking slowly with canes. The air was filled with music from a portable speaker, something soft, old, familiar. I spoke with a nurse, a young woman who said she loved the design because the halls don't feel like hallways, they feel like memories. I thanked her and walked on. Inside the main lobby, the dedication plaque still hung near the entrance. Crescent Oaks, founded in honor of compassion and dignity. My wife's name had been replaced by a line that read, "Under the visionary leadership of Daniel Alder." My son's full name, gleaming, center-aligned. I stood there for a long time. People passed by without noticing. A janitor polishing the tile gave me a polite nod. It occurred to me then that legacies are fragile things. They need guardians. And perhaps mine had been asleep too long. That evening I sat again at my kitchen table, the ledger beside the old blueprints. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger burns too quickly. What I felt was closer to determination, the same steady pulse I used to feel before a new project began. I realized this wasn't just about pride. It was about truth, about making sure the story of how Crescent Oaks came to be wasn't rewritten by convenience or greed. When I finally turned off the lamp, the room felt less like a mausoleum and more like a workshop. Plans were forming in the back of my mind, quiet, precise, inevitable. My son had forgotten that I built things meant to last. Tomorrow I would begin reminding him. The morning after I found the altered plaque, I woke before dawn. Habit, maybe. Years of rising early to meet construction crews. But this time, there was no sight waiting, only silence. The coffee maker sputtered, the smell of burnt roast filling the kitchen. I sat by the window watching the first gray light settle over the yard and felt something shift inside me. For the first time in years, I wasn't mourning. I was gathering. I started with what I had. Old contracts, invoices, emails, paper trails most people forget, but builders never do. My office still held boxes labeled Crescent Oaks, Phase 1. Inside were copies of every signed document, each dated and initialed in the corners. As I flipped through the folders, one sheet stopped me. An ownership agreement. My handwriting in blue ink, his in black. The signature lines looked normal until I noticed an extra page stapled to the back, one I had never drafted. It listed Daniel Alder, Chief Executive, Founder, and Proprietor. Founder. Not co-founder, not designer, founder. A word heavy enough to erase everyone else. The date printed below was a week after my wife's funeral. I stared at that paper until the edges blurred. The betrayal wasn't in the legal trick, it was in the timing. He'd waited until grief hollowed me out, until I wasn't reading carefully. My own son had built his empire on the silence of that mourning year. By mid-morning, I drove downtown to the records office. The clerk, a young man with tired eyes, typed our names into the system. "Yes, sir," he said. "Mr. Daniel Alder is listed as founder and sole owner of Crescent Oaks Development Group." He paused, glancing up at me. "There's a notation that the original architect, a Robert Callahan, was consulted." "That's me," I said. He blinked. "Oh, then something's off. Your license number is on the plans, but your name was replaced in the registry about 7 years ago." 7 years. Long enough for a false narrative to become fact. I thanked him and left. Outside, the city was loud with tourists, traffic, voices colliding. I moved through it like a ghost, holding the copy he printed for me. The page fluttered in the wind, the ink still smelling fresh, though the lie was old. That evening, I called a friend, Harold, a retired civil engineer who'd worked with me on the original foundation. He still lived across town. "Harold," I asked, "did you ever sign a revision after we finished?" He snorted. "Revision? No. Why?" "I think my son altered the filings." He was quiet for a beat. "You always did sign too much in trust, Rob. Family's supposed to be safe, but they know where the walls are weakest." After we hung up, I sat staring at the phone, hearing my friend's words echo. They know where the walls are weakest. The following days blurred into a pattern. Coffee, research, long drives to old partners who owed me small favors. Bit by bit, the picture formed. Daniel hadn't just taken credit for the design. He'd used my reputation to attract new investors. Promotional materials listed me as consultant emeritus, a polite way of saying out to pasture. My credentials, my awards, my decades of work, reduced to a decorative relic beside his name. One afternoon, I visited the main office of his company, a glass building that looked like ambition wrapped in steel. The receptionist smiled mechanically. "Do you have an appointment?" "Tell him his father's here," I said. Her eyes flickered, but she made the call. 5 minutes later, Daniel appeared. He looked impeccable, expensive suit, perfect hair, confidence rehearsed. "Dad," he said through a stiff smile, "this is a surprise." "I thought I'd see the empire," I said. He led me to a conference room, all chrome and echo. On the walls hung framed magazine covers featuring his face, visionary of senior living, the mind behind Crescent Oaks. Each headline a small theft. "I stopped by the records office," I told him. They say you're sole founder. He laughed lightly. You worry too much about titles. Titles define history. History's just perception, Dad. I streamlined the company's image. It's marketing. You replaced your mother's name on the plaque. He shrugged. It was time to modernize. People don't connect with memorials, they connect with success stories. I felt my pulse slow, the way it used to when a building inspector challenged my blueprints. You took advantage of me when I was grieving, I said. His smile hardened. You signed everything, nobody forced you. That sentence cut deeper than any insult. Nobody forced you. The truth of it made the betrayal complete. I left without another word. As I stepped into the sunlight, the mirrored doors reflected both of us, him standing tall inside, me small outside, like a man shut out of his own design. At home that night, I poured myself a drink I didn't finish. The liquid caught the lamplight, amber and still. I thought about Margaret, how she used to tell me that love without respect turns into pity. I realized I had let pity masquerade as love for too long. I opened the drawer where I kept personal letters and found the one my wife had written the week before she passed. I'd read it so many times the fold was nearly transparent. If he ever forgets who he is, remind him gently but firmly that he was raised by builders, not borrowers. Gently but firmly. That was her way. Mine would be the same, though firmness would have to outweigh gentleness now. The next morning I called Harold again. You still have contacts at the licensing board? Sure, he said. I need certified copies of every plan we filed under my license number, the originals, and if there's evidence of tampering, I want it documented. You're going after him? I'm defending what we built. There's a difference. The paperwork arrived 2 days later. Red ink stamps confirmed what I feared. Alterations, signature scans, date discrepancies. Each page was proof of how thoroughly he'd rewritten our shared story. By the end of the week, I had a folder thick enough to break a man's career. I didn't take satisfaction in it, only gravity. Betrayal, when fully understood, doesn't inflame, it clarifies. Saturday evening, I returned to Crescent Oaks. The sun was low, stretching long shadows across the courtyard. Residents sat in wicker chairs, watching birds in the fountain. I walked past them unnoticed and entered the administrative wing. The staff was changing shifts. I slipped the folder onto the desk of the director who had greeted me at the gala. When she looked up, startled, I said, "These documents belong to your archives. They show who designed this place and how the record was altered. Keep them safe." She nodded, confused but respectful. "Mr. Callahan, are you in trouble?" "No," I said, "but my son might be." Outside, the evening air felt cleaner. I walked the perimeter path my wife had insisted on adding, a quiet loop lined with magnolias. The lights came on one by one, glowing like patient hearts. I felt her presence in the rhythm of those lights, the quiet repetition of care. I didn't know yet how far Daniel's deceit had gone, how many lies were built into his foundations. But I knew the structure was unsound. Sooner or later, gravity always wins, and I, more than anyone, understood how to bring a building down safely when the rot reached its core. That night, for the first time since the gala, I slept without waking. Plans were forming. The kind of plans that didn't need revenge to feel righteous. Only the steady hand of truth setting every beam back in its rightful place. The next few mornings carried a peculiar stillness, the kind that follows a storm no one else has noticed. To the world outside, nothing had changed. Crescent Oaks still hosted its luncheons and charity events. Glossy brochures still promised elevated aging. But in the quiet of my house, a different kind of blueprint was unfolding. Not for a building this time, but for truth. I spent those days in the study surrounded by boxes, plans, and old letters, each piece of paper a relic of how everything had begun. My wife's handwriting appeared in margins like a gentle ghost. Add more windows here. Let the light in. I read her notes out loud, as if saying them could summon her steadiness back into the room. Grief has a way of rehearsing itself until it becomes a form of prayer. By midweek, I had created an order. 3 piles on my desk labeled design, ownership, and fraud. I wasn't sure which one hurt more to look at. The first pile reminded me of what we built together, the second of how he'd taken it. The third, of the small, efficient lies that made it possible. What I needed next was proof beyond my own records. Paper evidence convinces the mind, but the law requires corroboration. I called Harold again. "Do you still know anyone on the city planning board?" "1 or 2, he said. "You're serious about taking this to court?" "I'm serious about finishing what we started." That afternoon he arrived with a thermos of coffee and the kind of expression old friends reserve for funerals or war. We sat among the documents, cross-referencing permit numbers. He whistled low when he saw the discrepancies. "He didn't just rewrite history, Rob, he forged it. Backdated forms, substituted signatures, even copied your stamp." "I trained him well," I said quietly. "Too well. What do you want to do?" "Build a case." The next step was legal. I still had the number of the attorney who handled our land purchase years ago. A patient man named Lewis Grant, known for speaking softly and writing letters that made people panic. He met me the next morning in his downtown office, the same building where I had signed away more than I'd realized. Lewis listened without interrupting, then examined the folder I slid across his desk. "This isn't just a civil dispute," he said finally. "If those signatures were copied, we're looking at criminal falsification, possibly wire fraud depending on the investors involved. Can we prove it?" "With a forensic analyst and time. I have both." He smiled faintly. "Most men your age would just let it go. I built Crescent Oaks to honor my wife, not to watch it turn into someone's vanity project." Lewis nodded, understanding. "Then we'll start quietly. Subpoena the records, compare digital timestamps, track the funding transfers. You'll need to stay calm when the pushback comes. Calm is the only thing I've got left." The following week unfolded like a rehearsal for battle. Mornings began with calls from Lewis, afternoons with Harold scanning archives, evenings with me sitting by the window watching the city lights flicker on. Somewhere between exhaustion and focus, I began to feel alive again. The same current that used to hum through me before a major project's unveiling. Except now, the structure I meant to raise wasn't physical. It was justice. One night, as I was sorting receipts, I found a photograph tucked into an envelope. My son at 12, holding a model bridge we'd built together for a school fair. His grin was pure pride. I traced the outline of his small hands on the frame, remembering the smell of glue, the sound of his laughter. Somewhere between that child and the man who altered legal documents, the bridge had collapsed, and I was the architect who'd failed to reinforce it. I called Harold again, needing less data and more humanity. "Do you ever think we taught our kids too much comfort?" He sighed. "Maybe we taught them safety without struggle. You can't blame yourself for that." "Can't I?" Every indulgence was a blueprint for this moment. For the first time in weeks, I laughed, short, sharp, self-aware. It's strange how clarity can sound like laughter when it arrives. A few days later, Lewis called with news. "The analysts confirmed digital forgeries on several documents. Your original signatures were scanned from earlier contracts. It's airtight." I felt a weight lift, not entirely pleasant, like breathing easier after admitting a lifelong mistake. "What now?" We draft a notice of ownership claim. Once it's filed, he'll know. Are you prepared for that? I've been preparing for it my whole life, apparently. That night, I drove back to Crescent Oaks one last time before everything changed. The security guard recognized me from the gala and let me in. The corridors smelled faintly of lemon polish and faint nostalgia. Residents' laughter drifted from the lounge. I paused before a wall of framed photographs, images from construction to completion. In one, a much younger version of me stood beside my wife, both wearing hard hats. I reached out, brushed the glass with my fingertips. Behind me, a voice said, "Mr. Callahan?" It was the nurse I'd spoken to before. She smiled gently. "You're the one who built this place, aren't you?" "I suppose I am," I said. "You should know. People here still feel it. The warmth, the light. Whatever you designed, it worked." Her words landed like benediction. I thanked her and walked out before the emotion could unmake me. When I got home, I wrote a letter, not to my son, but to myself. A promise. No more silence. No more indulgence disguised as love. The next generation must learn accountability, even if it costs the last fragments of peace. I sealed the letter and placed it in the ledger where this story began. The next morning, Lewis filed the claim. A copy went to Daniel's office. Within hours, he called. "Dad, what are you doing? You're going to ruin everything." "I'm fixing what you broke. You'll destroy the company. I built it once. I can build again." He said something about lawyers, reputation, betrayal. I let him talk. When he finally ran out of words, I said, "Oh, son, gravity always wins. Be sure your structures can bear the truth when it lands." Then I hung up. Afterward, I sat in the quiet, feeling no triumph, only a deep steadiness. My wife's photograph watched from the shelf. The magnolia trees outside swayed in the afternoon wind, leaves whispering like applause, too soft for celebration but strong enough to say, "You did the right thing." That evening, Harold stopped by with a bottle of bourbon. We drank to small victories and long lives. "You know," he said, "you might actually win this." "I don't need to win," I told him. "I just need the record to tell the truth." He raised his glass. "Then here's to truth." I looked out the window at the faint glow of Crescent Oaks in the distance and felt the plan settle fully into place. The reckoning had begun, not out of vengeance but out of respect for the craft of living honestly. Every builder knows there's a point in construction where you must stop patching cracks and start tearing down the faulty sections before they collapse. I had reached that point, and tomorrow the demolition would start. There's a silence that comes before every reckoning. Not the calm of peace, but the stillness of inevitability. That morning when I woke, the air already felt charged. The city outside seemed sharper, the light more deliberate. My phone buzzed with a message from Lewis. "Board meeting confirmed for 10 a.m. All documentation verified. Be ready." I wasn't sure what ready meant anymore. My hands shook as I buttoned my shirt. The same steady hands that had drawn hundreds of blueprints, now unsteady not from fear, but from the weight of what they were about to erase. When I reached Crescent Oaks, the parking lot was already half full. Expensive sedans lined the entrance, their polished surfaces catching the morning sun like mirrors eager to show off. I walked past them with my folder tucked under my arm. The receptionist greeted me with a polite, uncertain smile. "Mr. Callahan, they're expecting you." The boardroom was a long rectangle of glass and wood, the kind of room designed for show rather than comfort. Daniel sat at the head of the table, surrounded by investors, attorneys, and the director. He didn't stand when I entered. His smile was thin, his eyes rehearsed for sympathy. "Dad," he said, voice dipped in false warmth, "you didn't have to come in person. We could have handled this privately." "I tried privacy," I said, "and it didn't take." A few people exchanged looks. Lewis set his briefcase on the table beside me and began laying out documents with the precision of a surgeon. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "my client, Mr. Robert Callahan, has filed for correction of ownership and authorship in relation to Crescent Oaks development. The following records show evidence of falsified filings and digital forgeries executed under Mr. Daniel Alder's authority." The word forgeries landed like a dropped hammer. Murmurs rippled around the table. Daniel leaned forward. "This is absurd. He's confused. He's elderly and—" "Old," I interrupted softly. "Not confused." Lewis continued, methodically sliding pages across the table. Photocopies, signatures, forensic reports, and the letter my wife had written years ago. Every piece was an anchor tying the truth back to its foundation. The director lifted one of the pages, her brow tightening as she compared signatures. Daniel tried to laugh. "So what? My father helped with early designs. That doesn't give him ownership of a corporation." I turned to him fully for the first time. "You didn't help with the designs, Daniel. You helped on them, like a student learns from a teacher. Every structural choice, every ratio, every corridor alignment came from those nights in our garage when you asked why symmetry mattered. And I told you to. Because symmetry reminds people that life still has balance." He shifted in his chair. "You're sentimentalizing this." "No," I said. "I'm remembering correctly." Lewis gestured toward the director. "Please read the project certificate, Exhibit F." Her voice trembled slightly as she read. "Primary architect and co-founder Robert Callahan. Secondary design assistant Daniel Alder." She looked up. "This was notarized 12 years ago." Silence followed, the heavy kind that swallows sound. Daniel's mask cracked. "You think this wins you something? You can't run this place. You don't know the business side." "I didn't come to run it," I said. "I came to reclaim its soul," a few investors whispered among themselves. One of them, an older woman with sharp eyes, asked, "Mr. Alder, did you remove your father's name from public materials intentionally?" Daniel hesitated. Too long. "It was a branding decision." "Branding fraud," Lewis corrected quietly. I watched my son's face, pride crumbling into panic. It should have felt like victory. It didn't. All I saw was a man trapped in a corner he built himself. Finally, Daniel stood. "You're ruining me." "No," I said. "I'm saving you from the ruin you were already courting." He slammed a hand on the table. "You think anyone cares who drafted the first blueprint? It's about expansion, legacy, growth." "Legacy built on lies collapses faster than bad concrete," I said evenly. "And you should know, I taught you that too." The director cleared her throat. "I've heard enough. Mr. Callahan, these documents confirm your authorship and founding contribution. The board will amend all public records accordingly. Mr. Alder, effective immediately, your administrative privileges are suspended pending legal review." The room exhaled in a single collective breath. My son's mouth opened, but no words came out. I stood slowly, gathered my papers, and said to the room, "Crescent Oaks was meant to be a place of grace. I hope it can still be." Then I turned to my son. "For what it's worth, I didn't want this to be public, but you left me no quiet way to tell the truth." As I reached the door, I heard him call after me, voice small for the first time since he was a boy. "Dad, wait." I paused. "Yes? Is there any way to fix this?" I looked back at him, the same man who once built model bridges in my garage, now adrift amid the debris of his ambition. "There's always a way to rebuild," I said. "But the foundation has to be honest this time." Outside, the air felt heavy but clean. I walked to the courtyard and sat on the same bench where I'd once watched limousines drive away. The magnolias were in bloom, their fragrance thick and forgiving. For the first time in a long while, I felt my wife close, not as memory but as presence. I whispered. We fixed it, love. Maybe not perfectly, but honestly. Later that afternoon, Lewis and I stood outside the courthouse, papers in hand. This could go further, he said. Press coverage, formal charges. Let it, I replied. Truth should be public if the lie was. He nodded, his expression equal parts respect and worry. You've done something rare, Robert. Most people your age would settle for peace. I tried peace, I said. It required too much silence. That evening, Harold called. Heard the news already. Half the city's gossiping. You all right? Tired, I said, but I feel lighter. That's how a man sounds after demolishing the rot. Proud of you, old friend. I hung up and poured myself a drink. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty anymore. Outside my window, the faint lights of Crescent Oaks glimmered like stars that finally remembered their source. I realized then that confrontation wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration, the rebuilding of something I thought lost, my integrity, my purpose, and the right to my own name. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the ache of what was gone, I felt a small, unmistakable flicker of peace. It's strange what follows victory. You expect celebration, but what comes instead is silence. Wide, echoing, disorienting. The day after the board meeting, I woke before dawn, expecting the same rush of purpose that had carried me for weeks. It wasn't there. The house felt heavier now that the fight was over. Justice, it turns out, has its own kind of emptiness. The morning light filtered through the kitchen blinds, catching the dust in soft halos. I sat at the table with my untouched coffee, listening to the refrigerator hum like a patient breathing in a hospital room. That's how grief feels after it's been given closure. Alive, but faint. By noon, I found myself driving aimlessly along the coast. The ocean always knew how to absorb human noise, even the kind that echoed inside. I pulled over near the marshes where the wind carried the scent of salt and decay and just sat there watching the water move. I thought of Margaret, my wife, and how she'd once said that healing doesn't arrive like lightning but like a tide. You don't notice it until you look back and see that the shoreline's changed. When I finally turned the car around, I passed Crescent Oaks. The gates were open. I hesitated, then parked. I hadn't planned to go in. I just wanted to see it one last time before the lawyers turned it into a case number. The director greeted me in the lobby, gratitude softening her features. Mr. Callahan, she said, the residents have been talking about you all morning. You're somewhat of a legend now. I smiled faintly. Legends are just stories that survived exaggeration. She laughed, then gestured toward the courtyard. Someone asked about you earlier, one of our volunteers. She said she met you the night of the gala. That's how I found myself walking toward the garden again. The nurse, the one with the kind eyes, was sitting on a bench reading to an elderly man in a wheelchair. When she noticed me, she closed the book and stood. I was hoping you'd come back, she said. I didn't plan to, I admitted, but here I am. Sometimes the best visits are the accidental ones. Her name was Evelyn Hart, retired nurse, part-time volunteer. She'd worked in palliative care for 30 years before moving south. People here remind me of my old patients, she said. They've survived everything except loneliness. We walked the garden path together. She moved slowly, not because of age, but because she believed in letting silence fill its own spaces. You built all this, she said. Did you ever imagine how many lives it would hold? No, I said. I imagined the architecture, not the people. She smiled. That's the difference between a builder and a healer. Builders think in structures. Healers think in rooms with light. Her words landed gently, the way soft rain falls on a roof that's been dry too long. I realized I hadn't spoken with anyone who wasn't a lawyer, accountant, or adversary in months. We sat by the fountain where the water shimmered under the late afternoon sun. The sound filled the pauses between sentences. "Your son came by this morning," she said quietly. I froze. "Did he?" "He didn't stay long. He looked lost." She studied my face, then added, "Forgiveness isn't for them, you know. It's for you." I wanted to argue, to say some betrayals don't deserve that word, but I couldn't. Because she said it not as advice, but as someone who had done it herself. We talked for hours about architecture and medicine, about the ways both professions demand precision and compassion. She told me about her late husband, a teacher who died 10 years ago. He used to say that love isn't measured by how long it lasts, but by how much of you survives in the other person afterward. I told her about Margaret, about the journals she left behind, the notes in my blueprints, the quiet way she made purpose out of order. Evelyn listened without interruption. When I stopped, she said softly, "You built something that still breathes, Robert. That's more than most people can say." Before I left, she handed me a small folded paper. "We host a music night every Thursday," she said. "Come if you feel like remembering what joy sounds like." That night I left the paper on my desk, telling myself I wouldn't go. But Thursday arrived and the house felt too empty to resist. So I went. The rec room was lit with soft amber lamps. Residents sat in a circle while a young man played piano. Evelyn waved me over. "We were just about to start requests," she said. I took a seat beside her, unsure of the rules of this new world. The pianist began playing a slow waltz, one I recognized from the early years of my marriage. Without realizing it, I was tapping my fingers to the rhythm. Evelyn noticed, smiled, and whispered, "You remember." "I remember everything," I said. Later, when the music ended, we walked outside together. The night was warm, the air carrying the smell of jasmine. "You look different," she said. "How so?" "Lighter, like someone who stopped carrying other people's mistakes." We reached her car. She turned before getting in. "You can't rebuild a life using demolition tools, Robert. At some point you have to switch to restoration." I nodded, unsure if I could, but grateful someone believed I might. The following weeks became a quiet rhythm of new beginnings. I'd visit Crescent Oaks twice a week, sometimes to walk the garden, sometimes just to sit and talk. Evelyn had a way of turning silence into conversation. We spoke about books, music, memory. She told me that tending to the elderly wasn't about saving lives, it was about witnessing them fully before the curtain closed. I began to notice the small details I'd overlooked for years. How sunlight traveled across the courtyard at noon. How residents greeted one another by name. How laughter echoed longer in rooms with high ceilings. The building I once saw as evidence of betrayal became once again a place of meaning. One afternoon, Evelyn and I watched two residents playing chess by the window. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked. "I used to," I said. "Now I think about what's still here." She smiled. "Then you're already healing." When I drove home that evening, the streets felt softer. The anger that had lived behind my ribs for so long had thinned into something else, acceptance maybe, or simply quiet. I realized that while justice had restored my name, it was Evelyn who had restored my peace. That night I opened Margaret's last journal again. In one margin she had written, "If you ever lose yourself in the fight to be right, look for kindness. It will lead you home." I looked out the window toward Crescent Oaks glowing in the distance and whispered, "I found it." It's remarkable how life rearranges itself after the noise fades. For months I had lived inside tension, lawyers, documents, accusations, but now the days unfolded quietly, like clean sheets over a made bed. Crescent Oaks was operating under new management, my name restored in the records, my wife's inscription returned to the plaque. Justice had found its place, not loudly but with the quiet authority of truth simply written back where it belonged. Yet peace isn't a trophy you hang on the wall. It's a practice. Every morning I woke early, brewed coffee, and sat by the window watching the marsh light change color. Sometimes I'd catch myself expecting the phone to ring with more chaos. It never did. The silence became my teacher. Evelyn and I settled into an easy companionship. She'd stop by after her volunteer shifts, bringing bakery muffins or fresh flowers from the market. We talked about everything except the past, as if we'd silently agreed that the future deserved its own vocabulary. On warm evenings, we'd sit on my porch listening to the cicadas rise and fade. She'd tell stories from her years in nursing. Funny, heartbreaking, deeply human. I'd listen, grateful for the ordinary sound of another person's voice sharing space with mine. One evening she said, "You know, you never told me what you'll do next. You've restored your name. What comes after that?" I thought for a moment. I've been thinking about the people who believed my son's company was real, the investors who lost their savings, the residents who trusted a name that wasn't mine. I want to do something for them, maybe a foundation, one that protects older people from financial abuse. Evelyn smiled. "That sounds like you." "Which part?" "The part that builds instead of destroys." Her words stayed with me. The next week I met with Lewis to discuss logistics. We drafted the papers for what would become the Margaret Callahan Foundation for Dignity and Trust. Its mission: to provide legal support and financial counseling to elderly victims of exploitation. I wanted the work to outlive me, not as redemption but as continuation. When I told Evelyn, she placed her hand over mine. "That's a beautiful way to honor her," she said. "And yourself." Word spread quickly. The director of Crescent Oaks invited me to speak at a community event. I hesitated at first. I was no speaker, but Evelyn said, "Sometimes people need to hear how strength sounds when it's spoken softly." So I went. The hall was modest, filled with residents, staff, and a few reporters. I stood behind the lectern, the same place where my son once stood making promises he couldn't keep. My hands didn't shake this time. "I built Crescent Oaks for love," I began, "and lost it for ambition. But what I learned is that legacy isn't what we build for others. It's what survives inside them after we're gone. My wife used to say that good design starts with compassion. Maybe good living does too." There was a long silence afterward, the kind that means people are thinking instead of applauding. That felt right. When the event ended, an elderly woman approached me. She held my hand and said, "My husband lives here. He says the light in the mornings makes him feel alive. Thank you for giving him that." Her gratitude reached me more deeply than any legal victory. It was proof that the original dream, Margaret's dream, still lived. That night I drove home under a sky stretched wide with stars. I thought about my son, where he was, what he was doing. We hadn't spoken since the confrontation. But one morning a letter arrived. The handwriting was careful, uncertain. "Dad, I've started over. Small firm, small clients, nothing like before. I'm trying to learn what you meant about foundations. I hope someday we can talk, not as rivals but as family. Daniel." I read it twice, then placed it in the ledger beside my wife's old letters. I didn't reply immediately. Forgiveness, I'd learned, should never be rushed. It needs to breathe before it's spoken. Weeks turned into months. Evelyn and I became partners not just in companionship but in work. She joined the foundation as outreach director, organizing workshops on elder awareness. Watching her speak to rooms full of people, I saw the same steadiness I'd once seen in Margaret. The calm authority of someone who believed kindness was practical, not sentimental. Together we transformed part of my old gallery office into a shared workspace for the foundation. The walls were painted pale cream, sunlight pouring through restored windows. I mounted a framed copy of the original Crescent Oaks blueprint above the desk. Not as nostalgia, but as reminder that even the most beautiful structures begin as fragile lines on paper, dependent on trust to become real. One afternoon, Evelyn found me there, sketching a small design on a scrap of graph paper. "What's that?" she asked. "A pavilion," I said. "For Crescent Oaks. Somewhere quiet for families to sit. I thought we could dedicate it to everyone who learned forgiveness the hard way." She smiled. "Then I suppose we'll need a plaque. Only if we promise not to let anyone rewrite it," I said. She laughed, the sound soft and sure. That evening we sat on my porch as the sun dropped behind the marsh. The light turned everything gold. The railing, her face, the magnolia leaves. She reached for my hand. "Do you ever think about how all this began?" "Every day," I said. "And every day I thank whatever grace let it end like this." She leaned her head on my shoulder. "You built a home out of ruin, Robert. That's not architecture, that's resurrection." I looked out across the quiet street, the world humming softly with evening, and realized she was right. Redemption doesn't come with applause or headlines. It arrives in small, ordinary moments, a hand on yours, a letter mended by humility, a building once stained by greed now glowing in the sunset. Before we went inside, I whispered into the fading light, "We did it, Margaret, the foundation's strong again." The wind moved through the magnolias, gentle, approving, and I swear I could almost hear her laugh in it. The next morning I drafted the foundation's motto in my wife's handwriting, traced from an old card she'd once written to me. "Build with kindness, restore with truth." That's how the story ends, not with vengeance but with balance. The father became a builder again, the son began to learn, and somewhere between memory and forgiveness, I found the courage to start living, not merely surviving. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more stories like this one. Tell me in the comments, what did this story make you think about? Family, forgiveness, legacy, everyone carries their own version of it. And as always, thank you for listening, for feeling, and for being part of this journey with me. Until next time, take care of yourself and the people you love.